Okay, this is this remainder of chapter 4. We finished a good part of it in class, but then we had a quiz and we had a label activity. So one of the last things we talked about before we started the presentation was we talked about label reading. So you did an activity where you wrote down the different fibers and contents of your label to see what was sugar, what was fiber. So one of the questions here is which of the following food we listed as simple sugar on the food label? Would it be cellulose, corn bran, guar gum, honey, or starch? If you saw those in the label. So cellulose is a very intense complex of glucose molecules, which we don't have enzymes to break down. Bran also is a type of cellulose. Guar gum is usually a lignin or a pectin, so it's still a soluble fiber. Honey is fructose and glucose, so that's a monosaccharide, and starch is usually like amylose, it's a chain of glucose. So the simplest form in a food would be honey. And then here, all of the following would contribute to a complex carbohydrate in a food label except. So complex carbohydrate would be a starch or anything that's more than a disaccharide, basically. So a modified starch could be maybe a 10 or 12 chain starch of glucose. Wheat flour enriched is still a starch. Corn flour would be a starch. Graham is a simple sugar. Graham flour is a wheat flour, another name for wheat flour. So the most complex would probably be wheat flour or graham flour in this situation because they're longer chain starches. Oh, okay, all except sugar. Okay, sorry. So sugar would not be complex. All of these others are starches, so they're not mono or disaccharides. They're longer chains. Then we were just ending with this being happy with sugar. So that's one of our downfalls in this country is we do drink and eat a lot of sugar. The biggest components of our diet that have sugar are snacks and sweets and beverages. It says not including milk or fruit juice, but I think of fruit juice as being a pretty concentrated sugar, simple sugar source. So you can see those are the two areas where we mostly get our sugar. If we look at the intake of what we're eating, the average intake of sugars, the recommendation is no more than 10% of your calories. This is what males at different ages, so young kids win for the least amount of sugar as well as the 51 and up. So the highest sugar intake is between ages 4 and 50, basically, especially at your age. The 14, 18, 20 years is very high. For females, very similar intake. So that's what the goal is 10% of your calories, which nobody can really think about what is 10% of your calories, but it ends up being about 9 teaspoons of sugar a day for females and 10 for males. It's pretty, you think of just teaspoons. And what's in a teaspoon? Like here's an example of sugars that just in drinks. So if you were to take this vitamin water, it's 8 teaspoons for one serving of that. Even though it's vitamin water, it still has some sugar in it. Or you could have this Gatorade, but that's about your limit for the day. That does not include the barbecue sauce or the ketchup or the desserts that you might consume. So that's a pretty low goal to try to get to that percent. So other sweeteners that you can try if you're trying to cut back, you like sweet things, but you don't want to take the calories, it's nutritive sweeteners we're just talking about now. The sugar alcohols are a little bit lower, 2 to 3 calories instead of 4 per gram. Or the non-nutritive sweetener, which we call NNS, non-nutritive sweetener, they provide very little energy and they're very sweet. Would those be okay? Would those be safe to use? So we can talk about those a little bit. But nutritive sweeteners are a variety of things. There's brown sugar, maple syrup, honey, turbinate sugar. And you can just see that these are the relative sweetnesses of different sugars. So lactose is the least sweet, fructose is the most sweet. That's why I mentioned that. Table sugar is fructose and glucose. So glucose is moderately sweet. Mix that with fructose, you get a pretty sweet flavor. And then honey is right there in the middle. High fructose corn syrup right along with that. High fructose corn syrup then, as you heard in your class, is 55% fructose instead of 50% in table sugar. And one of the concerns that we have, maybe the cause of obesity increase in use of this sugar, is that the way it's digested seems to be a little bit different. I did just see this recently. There is a decline in the use of high fructose corn syrup because of consumer concerns. They've cut back and used real sugar. Of course, the sweetener is all about the same. But the problem with the high fructose corn syrup, they believe, is that the way it's absorbed is a bit different, that it doesn't really require insulin surges. So sometimes they used to recommend it for diabetics because it wouldn't cause the insulin surge. But it's possible that it goes directly to the liver and is much more likely to be turned into fat. And it doesn't signal satiety, so people may not necessarily stop eating when they already had plenty of sugar. So that's one of the concerns for high fructose corn syrup, or fructose in particular. But as you can tell, the high fructose corn syrup is not that different. There's a 42 and there's a 55. There's different levels of fructose in these different syrups depending if it's used for baked goods or soft drinks. So that's one of the things you'll see in the literature. But here's a list of all the different names for sugar. You probably saw that with all your label reading you did. So beet sugar, maltose, rice syrup, dextrose, fructose syrup, turbinose sugar, yellow sugar. I mean, there's just multiple names. So in food industry, they can use any one of these. And some of them are better for different things. Some are better for baked goods. Some are better for candy bar. So you will see those as you do your label reading. And in order to reduce your sugar intake, some suggestions are using fresh fruit, whole grains, using less sugar in your recipes. I mean, people don't always appreciate that, but you can cut back a little bit. Using spices and herbs more often, and then just drinking lemon water. It's really refreshing. You don't have to have sugar in your water to make it taste pretty good. And then one of the reasons we try to stay away from sugar is because of the dental caries it can cause. The acid is produced as the carbohydrate is fermented in your saliva, and this causes an acidic environment, which then can cause demineralization of your enamel. And saliva attempts to make it neutralized, but so it depends on the balance of your saliva and how much sugar, how much acid is formed by the sugar fermenting in your mouth. The alternative sweeteners then we have are what they call, they have been checked by the FDA and marked as acceptable daily intakes, or ADI guide for each of these sweeteners, so that there's supposedly a safe level of how much you can have. So for instance, all of these sweeteners have these safe levels. So this, you could have 20.5 teaspoons, I think it is, per 100-pound person, or 12 teaspoons of stevia, all these different amounts, and these will be considered safe. Sucralose is pretty low because it can cause a lot of GI problems. People that have sucralose, they don't have enzymes, and sometimes it's like a lactose intolerance. You have the same kind of GI problem, so they make it a little bit lower because of that. So these are the 7 non-nutritive sweeteners that have been approved by the FDA. You might see these. Neotame you never really see listed. I think it has a number instead of a name, but it's only in baked goods and it's often used with another one of these sweeteners. The same with the asulfame potassium. That usually is mixed with another non-nutritive sweetener. So that's another whole area. And then the sugar alcohols, as I mentioned, can also cause this osmotic diarrhea. That's why they say limiting how much you have is a good idea, because it slows the water absorption and it can be malabsorbed. But the calories are, again, about half of what's in regular sugar. And it's found naturally in fruits and vegetables as well. So you might see these also in some of your food products. Saccharin then has been around for a long time. I mean, back in the 70s. It's rapidly excreted, does not accumulate. It's considered finally. In 2010, they said it was safe. You can look at the detail if you want to blow this up and see all the history of what they had to do to was developed way back in the 1800s. Been a lot of question about whether it was safe or not. I know we used to get Tab back in the 70s. It was like the first, non-nutritive sweetener drink. Aspartame has more recently been added to foods, and people are having problems with that, and now you'll see things that say no aspartame, because a lot of people have reactions of headaches, and with this particular, actually it's amino acids. An amino acid, which is a protein that was actually discovered kind of accidentally, that it's found to be very sweet, but people that have PKU cannot consume products with aspartame in them. And here's the reason why. Most people with PKU don't have an enzyme, so they don't produce This phenylalanine builds up because they don't have the enzyme to break phenylalanine to tyrosine. That's just a normal process. So without this happening, this builds up, which is the same product as in phenylalanine or in aspartame. So now aspartame builds up the same amino acid that's already a problem with a person with PKU. So some people can't consume that. Sucralose then is 600 times sweeter than sucrose. It's another one of those sugar alcohols. A tiny amount is digested, but most of it's excreted. Another one would be the asulfame K, or called Sunet. You might see Sunet. That's 200 times sweeter than sucrose. Again, it's not digested, which is why it's lower in calories. It's heat stable, so it can be used in baked goods, and they often mix it. Stevia is considered a natural sweetener. It's 100 times sweeter than sucrose. It's considered safe, even though it's a dietary supplement. It hasn't been really approved by the FDA, but it hasn't been shown to cause cancer. And it can ferment in the large intestine. It can lower blood pressure, and it's been treated for other things because it's basically an herb. And then the last thing is just making it, glucose available or carbohydrates available to your body. I think we've talked about how the digestion works. It's digestion, absorption. So what we have is you can start by breaking it down by cooking. I think we talked about this already, that cooking softens some of the fibers so that you can chew and swallow it better. And then as you're chewing it, of course, we have enzymes in our mouth that help with breaking down the beginning of the starch. It has an amylase, and it can actually lower the pH slightly. And then as you, moving ahead here, sorry, as you digest it, here are the enzymes, the amylase in your saliva, as well as these, enzymes and that's in your small intestine. We talked about these in class already. Glucose and galactose are considered actively absorbed, whereas fructose is only by facilitated diffusion. It's even this, in other words, the first one takes ATP, this does not. No carrier, no energy, so it's easily metabolized into fat and glycogen in your liver. And so when we put glucose to work in our body, just the last little minute here we have is that we have energy, of course. We want the carbs. We also want fat. Those are the best sources of energy as opposed to protein. So that's why we call carbs a protein-sparing macronutrient, because it will allow proteins to be used for tissue building and muscle building and not for energy. And protein, also the energy from carbohydrate is particularly important for the brain. And if we don't have enough glucose, you can always burn fat, which is when the ketones, which is a very easily digested fat, will become available for your energy levels. And then we'll learn about this, I think, in chapter 14, but if you've learned some biology already, we know that when we do consume glucose, glycogen breaks to glucose, and then it turns into smaller and smaller pieces, portions of micronutrients, which then break down until we have energy, which is called ATP. So that's what the source is. Inside the mitochondria and the cytoplasm, we can gain a lot of energy. In the last little section of chapter 4 talks about the health, and mostly about diabetes. And another thing we didn't mention yet was the metabolic syndrome. So diabetes is something we want to prevent by not consuming too many calories or too much refined sugar. So the metabolic syndrome is what they've established to be the contributing factors to possibly diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So if we can prevent abdominal obesity, high blood triglycerides, high blood pressure, low fiber intake, all these things can be contributing to this metabolic syndrome, which then leads to chronic disease. So it's kind of the prevention of trying to prevent high blood pressure, high HDLs, high glucose, high triglycerides, and abdominal obesity. So we do that by reducing our simple and refined sugar intake, increasing our fiber, and increasing our physical activity. So those are the health goals for carbohydrates, is try to eat the right carbs, not necessarily change the amount of carbs, but just change the type of the content of our carbs. Those are the main points of chapter 4. And starting next week, we'll be going to proteins. So have a great weekend. Thanks.